Hello, my name is Alex Padelka, and on behalf of CMG, I will be a moderator for this webinar. Today's webinar would be Think Like a CIO, how to prepare your apps for Q4. You may check CMG website cmg.org for other events and upcoming Performance and Capacity Conference in San Antonio, Texas. Our speakers today are Joe Romello, Retail Practice Director at Nous Infosystems and former CIO of companies including GSI Commerce, Michaels, and Garden Ridge. Also, we are joined by Brett Stoner, Senior Performance Engineer for Neotys and former Performance Lead for HR Block. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Joe.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Romello. I'd like to give you some insight into how to prepare for Q4 based on my personal experience, some scars, and a lot of blood. In the current context, digital experience this year will be critical. Mobile uptake and web uptake is increasing, as you're all well aware. And so the experience online is a direct reflection of the brand. It contributes to, compares, and contrasts with your in-store experience. And what customers are going to do is expect to have information now across all your channels. It doesn't just affect digital, although that's the highlight of this slide, but for you guys that have to deal with infrastructure, you're going to feel pressure from internal logistics, your warehouses, your stores, your suppliers, the call centers, your back office infrastructure. You're going to experience increased hours of operation. You're going to have temporary staff, and you're going to have tighter timelines for reporting and insight. In general, everything in the fourth quarter gets squeezed. Your customers aren't the only one that say, I need it now. The CEO is going to be up at the crack of dawn wondering how last night's sales were. You're going to be getting questions from your merchandisers and your marketing guys during the day, every 30 minutes, every 15 minutes, every hour. How's progress? How are sales? Are ticks up, ticks down? What's the checkout lines look like? So from an infrastructure standpoint, tremendous pressure is going to be pressed. If you lived through last year, it's only going to be worse. I try to give you some insight on the next slide as to how to corner this beast. And primarily, Brad, if you flip, it's size the problem. You got to get some sort of demand estimation. Be conservative. It's only going to help you. Try not to be surgical. We won't really know until New Year's whether we were right or whether we were wrong. You're going to have to look at it by business unit. As I said before, infrastructure is going to be pressed internally as well as externally. Your customers are going to be both internal, at your DCs, your supply chain, your call centers, your back office folks, sales audit, finance. They're going to press you for immediate response. They're going to want the infrastructure up and operating. You're going to have increased staff in the field. You're going to have temporary staff. You're going to get pressure from all sides, not just from your customers. The marketing guys are going to try to drive as much traffic as they can to your mobile sites. They're going to drive as much traffic as they can to your website. And those sites are going to try to drive traffic into your stores. Try to get some handle on the demand. Next slide, what I would suggest is take a look at some external inputs, the economy. Look at the guidance that your CEO, whether you're public or private, your CEO is forecasting what he thinks sales is going to look like. You're going to look at what your sales are today and in the past and see how they're increasing. If you've just gone through any sort of M&A activity, you're going to look at that and combine it in. If you've got shared infrastructure, then factor that in as extra demand. If you've got siloed infrastructure, you're going to have to look at it much more in a siloed way. But overall, what you're trying to do is get some trends on calls are going to go up, visits are going to go up, orders are going to go up, packages are going to go up, inbound processing, you're going to get more trucks per day at the DCs. You're starting to crunch already. I'm sure that August deliveries have already started to back up to the dock. And then you're going to get the inline promotions where the marketing and merchandising guys start to look at how the trends are going, and if they're up with hot products, they're going to try to push more, and if they're down, they're going to try to bundle up and promote. In any event, the infrastructure is going to get stressed. Next slide, Brad. Don't try to be too concise. Like I said, in this case, being conservative is really going to help, but you have to get some key metrics that you can measure at a high level. Transactions per day per store, whether it's brick and mortar, on the mobile device, or on the web. Packages per day out of your DCs. That will result in manifest to your shippers. That's going to create back office demand out of your ERP. You're going to be looking at average order value and items per basket, because that's what management cares about. That's dollars and cents and trends. Size of the product catalog, if you've got to put it up on the web or get it down to your cache servers, then the size of the catalog, the number of images, the number of SKUs, the ones that come in and out of stock, pricing, your promotions, your emails, your tabs, your inserts, if you're doing weekly inserts, email promotions, the volume and timing of those, and then the hours of operation. Everybody's working literally around the clock, and so is the infrastructure. The infrastructure is going to be asked to do what it does in a normal 12-hour day in 24-hour days. There's going to be no break for downtime. There's going to be no breaks for archives. There's going to be no breaks for maintenance. What I would suggest is get some high-level estimates so that you can guide yourself through and see where the heat's coming in. And again, this doesn't have to be precise. What you really want is upper bound, so you know when the thing is going to melt. Next slide. IT is going to increase exponentially. You're going to get all kinds of load on your infrastructure. If it hasn't started to heat up right now, it will by the end of this month, and by Halloween, it's going to be all out, and then it's not going to stop until you come down in January. Business KPIs are the things that you want to manage too, and break those down so that you have infrastructure measurements. So packages per day is going to be number of waves at the warehouse. It's going to reflect directly what your order volume is on the web, on mobile devices, and how much gets through sales audit. You're going to have heat taken on your credit card processors, brick and mortar switches, as well as your online conduits and service providers. The service levels you need to manage too, and be proactive about getting ahead of them. Once that service level drops, it's too late, because everybody's got a 1 or 2 hour response. You've got to get ahead of it. So having good performance indicators that you can trend to are going to be the things that give you a heads up on when to make the call, when to bring on additional infrastructure, whether you're horizontal or vertical. Everything that moves in the enterprise is a bit, and that bit's going to move through your infrastructure. You need to make sure that you can watch it as it heats up and try to get ahead of the problems when they will occur. Not can occur, they will occur. You're going to have most inopportune times when these things break. The one thing that I want to spend time on before we even get to what I'm going to consider my piece and Brad's piece is, on the next slide, cash is king. The CEO cares about one thing, and that's whether the CFO is happy with what's going into the cash still. For you guys, you need to make sure that your web and mobile transactions are working at the speed of the customers. In your stores, if you've got POS responsibility, you're going to make sure that the cashiers are working at the speed of scan or the speed of the customer. The last thing you want to have happen is somebody hanging a transaction on the web because of the 3 or 4 second delay, or on a mobile device, independent of connectivity, whether you got AT&T or Verizon or some other carrier. Your infrastructure needs to be moving at the speed of the customer, or they will move on. This is a heated time If you've ever been in a marketing Q4 for that last product that's on a shelf somewhere, you know how you will hop around sites looking for that product, trying to garner the purchase so that you can put it under the tree. You need to make sure that these infrastructure elements, because a lot of them are cached and a lot of them are off-premise, are working at the speed of the customers. These two things will hang you with a CEO. He doesn't care how you lost the sale. He just cares that the sale was lost. And he doesn't want to be having to tell the stockholders in the first quarter that we had unrecognized and unsatisfied demand. Very bad thing, whether you're public or private. Okay, so now let's get down. We're 10 weeks away, plus or minus, and what are the things we can do? Next slide, Brett. So the demand profile, you build a couple of slides back. What you really want to do is make sure that you get it out to the business units so that they can give you their requirements. They've been heads down trying to figure out how they're going to manage stuff, and they think that IT is just going to be there. Try to get ahead of it, reach out to the DCs, reach out to the call centers, reach out to your marketing guys, reach out to the merchandisers, how many prices are going to be moving across the line, talk to the back-end folks at the ERP site, and get some estimates of what the demand looks like from your internal customers and where they believe that the external customers are coming from. Take your back-end processing windows apart. Now's the time to jettison anything that isn't key to moving transactions or moving product or moving inventory through the system. Archive processes, do them offline. Find a way to break those off and move them and process them off the main infrastructure. Today, if you need infrastructure, you need to try to place orders now. The backup in demand for servers and associated switches, hardware, load balancers is enormous. If you can't order it today because of your purchase process, then look for either managed service or cloud offerings. The demand on server manufacturers right now is just incredible. And finally, the most important thing is you can't manage it if you can't measure it. So if the infrastructure is lacking in certain places for instrumentation, now's the time to jump on it and get it instrumented. You need to not just look at raw memory and CPU cycles and I/O and bandwidth, but you have to bubble those up into how they affect the KPIs that you built for the business. On the next slide, take apart your web and mobile infrastructure. Evaluate how horizontally you can scale. Evaluate how vertically you can scale. Horizontally, prepare for it now. Get those images ready so that you can just turn them on. Or better yet, bring them on and keep them nascent or quiescent. Again, the KPIs, I just can't tell you enough from the scars that are itching right now. If you don't have a good track on KPIs, you're going to be overrun by this thing. We had 300 servers that were instrumented top to bottom. 300 servers don't give me any information. I need to be able to measure transactions per second. 300 servers just happens to be my server farm. So the KPIs have to be brought down from the business KPIs down to things that you can now actually measure. And then right-size your KPIs to your stacks and the purpose of your alarm. So if the switches, if the load balancers are starting to choke, it doesn't matter how good the server farm is. You're going to have a problem moving bits across the infrastructure. If you've got multiple data centers, wherever you're doing load balancing, whether it's in the cloud or you're bringing it to a center and then repurposing that, test it, break it now. Now's the time to break it. Break it either in your test environment or break it in the backup environment or your warm backup or wherever. But now's the time to go see the alarms come off, understand what they do so that you can be prepared. Get your escalation lists together. You want to be able to bring human resources online when you need them. Drill, practice. This is just like back when you used to play football or baseball in high school. Practice, practice, practice. Now's the time to learn when you have some breathing room. You don't want to be learning when you've got a crisis, because when the clock starts ticking, seconds means dollars, and management's not tolerant of losing dollars while you're trying to figure out what the problem is. So practice breaking things to see where your alarms trigger, adjust the alarms, adjust the monitors, practice it again, get the entire team behind it. 3 o'clock calls in the morning just to see if everybody's awake and gets to the laptop in 5 minutes is not out of the realm of reasonableness at this point in time. This will only save everybody's butt down the line. The larger stacks that you have, the more data centers you have, the more importance it is to have data center level or stack level KPIs. Chasing after individual servers is not the kind of thing you want to alarm against. And if you have a single server and you're alarming against a single server, then you need a second server. And then finally, in a test environment, next one, Brad, please. In the test environment, get yourself a representative stack. And now down every device with your team. Practice what the indication is of the alarm. Practice what the response is. Get the escalation teams working. Do the documentation. Make sure you get enough log files for forensics, because if you don't know what the root cause is, I guarantee you a week or 2 weeks later, or at the most inopportune time on Black Friday or Cyber Monday, you'll get smacked in the butt. Test catastrophic failure. If any of you guys were around in 2001 when the Baltimore Harbor Tunnel had a tanker in it that caught fire and took down May East, you'll realize that geographic load balancing was something that none of us really gave much credence to, but everybody wanted it in the seconds and hours after that happened. Global traffic overall increased, or global response rate overall, because of May East being down, increased about 330%. Websites were locking up. You couldn't finish transactions. You couldn't even make some phone calls. If you have geographically dispersed load balancers on your data centers, test it now. Now's the time to test it to make sure it'll come up. If that's your catastrophic backup and recovery, now's the time to go to your compliance and your risk folks and test it. We've got some time right now to go test that stuff, and you've got time before the final software release comes in. Now's the time to test to make sure that the bits, the bytes, the cables, the switches, the routers, the servers are all lined up and ready for fourth quarter. The heat is coming. It's just a question of time. If you were here last year, you know it's coming. Brace for the long nights and the sleepless nights. And now the software guys are going to come in and tell you, now that your infrastructure is all tuned for you guys, we've just made a few minor tweaks. So I'm going to turn this over to Brad, and hopefully Brad will take you through how to go help with your software test. Thanks for listening. I hope that you got something out of this.
Joe, awesome points. I really appreciate that. I think it sets up really well for the content that I have that I'm going to cover, and that's just kind of going one level deeper, echoing kind of what you're talking about, and kind of helping people establish a plan for testing to some of the situations that you went over. My background, obviously working for a tax company, everything was based on a peak. So you'd go beginning of February, you'd have 100% of your projected load, you'd have your peak on day one of the week. So that's a really interesting situation that I come from. And I was looking at Facebook the other day at a post from my one of my power provider, and the power provider basically shared a graph that showed this is utilization and power consumption in your area over the past 6 days trended against temperature, and we expect temperature to go up the next 3 days, therefore expect blackouts, expect dips in power. And sure enough, I had 3 blackouts that day. Well, we obviously can't do that because we're not in the business of just telling people, hey, can you buy less during peak? That's a terrible business model for all of us. So we really have a unique challenge of how we're going to do these things. I really love Joe's point about not being too surgical. The stuff that we get as performance engineers are projections. And when a projection comes to a perf engineer, if you have somebody on the business analytics side, somebody on the executive level side. If they've all added 20%, you now have a very, very interesting projection because you've padded and padded. On the other side of that, they might not have taken account something that marketing was going to send out that drives everybody to your website. We all know the examples of Super Bowl traffic. We all see the reports that come out that next day saying who failed, and honestly, a lot of people fail on that because it's unexpected traffic. So my recommendation for performance engineers on where to start for this is don't make your test setup too complex. Don't spend 3 days trying to get the exact same utilization curve that you see in production, because honestly, it's not going to provide a ton of value. If you can just barely skirt through the day, and if there's 10% give or take in either direction, and you don't know what your system is going to do, that's a problem, and you need to be ready for that. So, what to test? Test a peak plus, okay? So take 150% of what people are giving you and test that. And don't ramp down halfway through the day. Keep that going. So the 150% applies to both total transactions in that day, and Joe was really bringing this point home when he was saying, you have all these back-end systems that are doing this processing. So what happens when you stress those? And now you have some kind of batch-oriented process, and it's doing 150% of the orders in the day. So not only just test for higher concurrency, but also test for higher workload over the specific given time. If you're testing these kind of volumes for 10 minutes, you're going to miss a lot of performance defects, okay? I think most retail shops and e-commerce shops, their traffic is 16 hours. If you look, people come on at 6, 7 a.m. If you're geographically diverse, it may be even longer than that. So you need to run tests that are at least to that same amount of time. So being a perf engineer, that's a great place to get started. Additionally, if your site is slow to begin with, when it's not under load, you have a problem. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit in front-end optimization. So pay special attention to that. Make sure your site's fast even when it's under low volume. That's another great place to get started. Now, when you're looking at projections, some people test for peak day. And if you look at peak day, you might have 1 hour that has 12 or 13% of all your traffic in that 1 hour. So as a performance engineer, if you have web logs, if you have previous things from last year, make sure you're really looking at peak minute and peak hour statistics to build your projections against. Okay, so that's a great takeaway for people that are new to performance testing. If you just test to an average or something else, you're gonna miss something there. Additionally, I've worked on platforms where load would, kind of just like the power company example I gave, load would build day after day after day, and as Joe stated, you need to know that. You need to be seeing this trend so that you can say, well, if this continues on Monday, the system's going to fall over. So these are things that you can start building for remediation plans against now. The other thing that I thought Joe mentioned that was really great was about shared architecture and network services. So you'll have people testing, team A will be testing a web app, team B will be testing a back-end application, and those are all in their own environments, completely isolated. In production, you might have SSO, Active Directory, DNS is going to be shared. So under these peak conditions where you have all the systems being busy and doing different things, you could potentially find a defect with the shared architecture. So pay special attention to that and make sure that's part of your test strategy as well. Contingency planning. So if you're a small shop, this might be very critical. One of my first jobs as a performance engineer, I think we had 5 or 6 servers, and that's all we had. There was no cloud. So we actually came up with a contingency plan that said, if users are already in the system, let them complete their orders. That way they at least will have a good experience. We're not going to let anybody else in. They're going to have a poor experience, but at least the people that are online can complete their transactions. So you'd be surprised for some of these what-if scenarios that you might run into. A lot of people think, hey, I could just spin up extra capacity and right at the last minute move that into production. I personally have recommended that, have exceeded thresholds for max database connections because I spun up too many web servers and then have the database go down. So based on my recommendation of adding additional capacity by looking at some KPIs and measurements, I actually caused the system to crash. So that's one thing you need to be aware of. So you need to test these things ahead of time. Other things that I've run into, you might have a credit card processor that fails. So people would actually design, the engineers would design the system that said, for all transactions, just let them be accepted. We'll go through them later. We're going to deal with them batch, deal with one-off, because inevitably the majority of transactions are going to get through, and we want that to happen, and then we can sort things out later. We do not want to stop that flow of the cash is king, the money coming into us. I remember, when I was in high school working at a grocery store, if the grocery store had a power outage, they weren't going to shut their doors. They weren't going to make it so people couldn't come in and buy things. They'd get out the old credit card readers, they'd get out pens and paper, and they'd continue to let the purchases happen. So testing some of these what-if solutions, the unknown unknowns, are things that we as test engineers can really get ahead of. I don't know if you guys remember, but Netflix a while ago had an issue where their cloud provider went out, and it was like one of the first outages from that cloud provider. These things happen. Amazon had the squirrel in the data center. I've personally seen data center zones overheat and shut down systems during peak time. So there's a lot of these things that you can test for. Of course, it might not be the first test you do, but it's definitely a consideration. Lastly on this is DDoS attacks. So if you're a large retailer, you might have you have the potential for a DDoS attack. I actually witnessed this when I was working at a different large tax company, where we started to see some odd behavior on our systems, found out it was DDoS, had to move behind a DDoS prevention provider, took about a day or two. So these things are real, they do happen, and just being aware of them can help you ensure stability of your season. A lot of times I'll go into a project and somebody will tell me this is a high availability environment, negative testing is not necessary, we don't have to test failovers, and then of course you say let's test failovers, and you find interesting things. You find load balancing isn't set up properly. You find it might be IP persistent and you have one office of everybody in your call center that's going to hit one server instead of hitting all the servers in your load balancer. So load balancing is something that comes up time and time again in projects. Definitely something you need to test, definitely something you need to verify. Auto scaling is great if you've tested it and know it works. A lot of people use it successfully, myself included, but these are things that you need to test. You need to do comparative reports. You need to have tools that allow you to do these things. So that's critical. I like the picture because it's asking how many apples you wish to buy, and it says pears, which really kind of gives an idea of the things that you're looking for. One of the simplest ones is taking down a AB power switch and seeing if all the cables are actually plugged into both A and both B. Out of every single time that I've done that test in my life for data center season readiness, we find 10, 15 servers that are both plugged into the same power strip. So, I mean, these are the type of things that people need to be aware of. This is the kind of attention to detail you need to ensure your application is going to work properly. Also with database failover testing, it can take a minute, maybe 30 seconds under zero load conditions, but under load conditions, you really need to know what that time is. If you have a cluster process for the failover that's taking longer than expected, you're not going to know that unless you've tested it. You should know that a failover of the database takes exactly 10 minutes. If it's not 10 minutes, if it's 20 minutes, 30 minutes, this is what we're going to do to remediate that. So these are the kind of things that you need to look at to ensure you minimize downtime if you do have to deal with downtime. Same with active-active, it applies all over the place. Joe also mentioned cutting out non-essential load. And non-essential load can be in a lot of interesting places. You might have debug turned on somewhere. You might have reports that people want to run but are not really critical to the flow of transactions. So you really want to take as much resources as you can and give them to transactional flows. Let an order move through your front end, your order system, through your call center if needed, and all the way back out to shipping and receiving. That's where you need to make sure your resources are. If there's some type of behavior that users can do in your system that is resource intensive and might not be something that they necessarily need to do on peak, you can move that to a disabled status. So a user or two might be a little unhappy with that, but ultimately you're protecting the platform. So if you have a fixed budget or fixed resources, there's a lot of different strategies for addressing that. If you have patching on ESX hosts that are going, vulnerability scans, backups, during the day, these are some of the things that can be moved to the end of the week, or they can be moved to the nights, or you might not want a vulnerability scan happening in production in peak hours. I see that at least once every 2 years from consulting that I do, and that's something that gets people quite often. Additionally, I'd say static resources are non-essential load. So if you have a data center, if you're hosting your own site, move that out of your data center. You do not want to choke that pipe with unoptimized PNG files. You want to make sure that the server order traffic can get through. So I'd also classify that as non-essential and move that off where possible. I mentioned logging. And this kind of ties back to the 150% testing strategy. You may have one server that has debug on. You might have your logging level set so it makes in a normal day 1 gig, and in peak at 150% of your load, it might be 10 gigs and fill up a file system and cause a server to crash for honestly no good reason. So by doing some of these high volume, long duration tests, you're going to be able to see these things, remediate them before your users do. If you're in an enterprise space where you have large clusters or large load balance systems, one thing that I've seen as a successful strategy is making sure these are broken out into service groups or clusters. That way, if one of these things goes down, if a read-only node and the servers attached to that go down, it's not going to bring down your whole organization. It'll bring down part of the application, but not everything. People that are using containers also seem to like this, where a container can drop off, but not potentially your whole system. So a little late to be doing that now, but keep it in mind for next year. And then, of course, call center wrap-up. If I have some kind of call center application so customers can call in and user agents can look up data, I'm going to test that. If the call center app is running twice as slow because of volume, that removes their efficiency. You then have to have additional agents, hold times get longer, so call center applications are critical to the enterprise even though it might not be your front end. Make sure you test those. This one might be a little controversial. People might push back on me a little bit about this one, but my experience as an incident manager for a Fortune 500 company gave me a lot of lessons about limiting user access in production. So inevitably, there's this one little tweak that we forgot, or we're going to change this log setting on the fly. Oh, I forgot changing the log setting in IIS causes IIS to restart, so now we have an outage. Locking down your environment, limiting access, limiting hands that have access to the environment is a great way to ensure uptime and stability in peak, whether that's SAs, devs, DBAs, QAs. It's something that each organization needs to consider. And when you're looking at monitoring performance, you also need to pay special attention to changes in the environment. And this goes back to what Joe said about lessons learned and root cause analysis. You need to know how to correlate these things. You need to be able to answer the what happened question. And if it's not performance related, If you're on any incident management bridge, of course, the first question they're going to ask is what changed, who changed it, and when that happened. And the reason people ask that is because it's something that happens often, and it's something that can cause outages. So just a little bit about how to optimize your systems so you could ensure your uptime. All right, we're going back to a little bit about production usage versus baseline. Now, when I was in operations and I would receive an alert for a CPU at 80%, I used to say, this is a silly monitor. Why are we looking at this? 80% is fine, system should run fine. Well, being on the performance side of things now, I really see this in a different light. I see it as if the performance engineers tested their application to full load and CPU utilization should be at 50%, 80% is a huge increase, and this indicates that there is something that we don't know going on or some other type of potential problem. So just because the alert threshold might not be as high as operations might want to see, it could indicate a issue on your system. That kind of leads me to user behavior and what happens to users on peak. So not only is system utilization changing, but user behavior is also changing. If your site is slow, people will refresh. So that might increase the number of potential transactions on your back end 2- or 3-fold. Those are the type of things that you need to be ready for. When I am doing my holiday shopping on e-commerce sites, I might be afraid that one of the items that I'm trying to purchase will actually go out of stock. So instead of adding 30 items to my cart and then checking out, I will actually check out every time I add something to my cart so I can ensure that there's going to be stock there. And going back to user projections, they're just projections. You need to test some of these odd situations that you might not be expecting, but just know that user behavior also changes during peak. So your number of orders per second might increase 5-fold, which might be using 30% more CPU than expected. So now you're going to have a capacity issue as traffic increases on your site. So knowing what a baseline is, checking production usage against the baseline is also very critical. One of my favorite stories has to do with type ahead. So I was looking at some production metrics for for search and found that it was roughly 5 times higher than what we were expecting. So the search servers, the GSA appliances were getting hammered, and we had really no idea why. Come to find out, there was a change that went in, and it was with type ahead. So the average word in the English language is 5.1 characters, so people were typing things in there, and every time somebody pushed a button, it was doing a search, whereas at the end of the word it was previously doing a search. So what we ended up doing was going from active-passive to active-active on our nodes. We lost redundancy, but we increased capacity. And of course, before we did that, we tested it to make sure it wouldn't bring down anything by doing that. But these are the kind of things that people run into. These are things that I personally run into. And then lastly, about monitoring your environment. If you are running releases during production times, the one thing you don't want to have happen is a 7 a.m. call from a C-letter executive saying, why is the system down? Why, load levels aren't that high, what's going on? And inevitably, there was a release that went out last night, the night before, it didn't go as anticipated, or the rollback strategy didn't happen. So increased levels of QA for when you do have to have releases. I'm going to switch back to peak configuration because I want to talk about that just a little bit more. And one thing that brings up interesting things about peak configuration is your system may run perfectly well 90% of the time, no issues. But for peak, you might have to do interesting things to have that run, just to be able to hit those new levels. So instead of testing this one monolithic load profile that you've done over and over and over, and then your final test says, yes, everything is fine, I'm doing this test so I could share metrics with the team, what you'd really want to do here is vary what you're testing. So the business might say, we expect 20,000 orders in this hour and 5,000 returns. Well, you need to be able to answer the question, what happens if we have 10,000 returns and 15,000 orders? So as a performance engineer, don't just stick with one load profile and test that all season. You're going to miss things. Take these specific use cases, test them higher, test them lower. See what use cases use more system utilization, begin to optimize those. If you always have a very complicated setup where you're doing everything at one time, it's really hard to dig through and see what's using the most CPU. Whereas if you test each use case and each activity on the system to a certain level, certain baseline level, you know how you can start to get some of the optimizations, and you can really start digging into those specific use cases to tune. All right, that's my little portion of it. Alex, I'm going to kick it over to you for your slide and potentially some questions. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Hello, we have some questions. So first question is, should we test production?
Good question, interesting question. If you're new to performance testing, I'd say no. If you have an organization that has been doing performance testing for a while, if you have confidence in remediation plans to be able to configure production for testing and roll back, then that's something you look at. It's usually the more evolved test organizations that are doing testing in production. That being said, as a test engineer, I always wanted to be testing in production. Inevitably, I was being asked to certify this environment with sustained peak load, so I want to be able to test in that exact environment. QA or some kind of scale environment might be similar, but I mean, I've seen types of issues where it's a different firewall, and you can overrun the firewall in production, and you have a newer firewall in test, and it's just fine. So if you really want to capture the entire sphere of potential performance defects, try to test in the production environment, do it with caution, and don't have it be your first test.
And maybe perhaps related question, how can we test production load if we don't have any infrastructure built to generate the load?
Yeah, that is a nice tie-in, Alex. Thanks. And I think that's an interesting question. So obviously I'm biased because I work for a company that makes test tools, but a lot of test tools out there allow you to spin up infrastructure, you know, having AWS, SoftLayer, Rackspace, all these guys. You no longer have to house your load generating system in-house. So I don't recommend everybody go out and buy $40,000 worth of hardware just to do this test. I'd recommend potentially look at hosting things in the cloud, generating load from outside your firewall, at least when possible, and that'll, number one, give you better results, more realistic results, and number two, you don't have to worry about, is my load generating platform causing my performance issues? Something that it's just a time waste if you're an engineer working on poorly configured load generators.
Another question, for peaks, do you look for max, or do you seek something like the 19th percentile?
I think, you know, I covered this a little bit, but whatever max is, I want to know what happens when a projection is wrong. I want to know what happens when max is off by 30%. So, you know, you always want to kind of look over the edge of the cliff and see what's going to happen when you increase load a little bit. I can't tell you how many times halfway through a season I'd have somebody come to me and say, hey, we want to do this marketing campaign, or we're going to add more TV commercials. Will the system handle a 15% increase in load, even though you guys have already done your seasonless readiness test and you're in lockdown? And the optimal response from a performance engineer is, well, tell you what, we already tested that. We already know what it looks like. Here's what needs to happen to make that successful, and it's already in place. So, I mean, if you're going for the wow factor, if you have the time, I'd say testing higher and building it out with a little more capacity is the way to go. I've never gotten in trouble for overbuilding an environment within reason. I have gotten in trouble for underbuilding an environment, because obviously that's going to cause a last-minute scramble that makes executives not happy, to say the least. So those are some of those plans that you should have in place and have tested before you go into peak, where possible.
Okay. Next question. How long do you typically run a load test for a user-facing application? Hours, days, weeks?
Yeah, and that's a good question, and it really depends where you are in the tuning cycle. I've given a few other webinars that talk about test one server first, so you're looking for code level defects, then test a specific test to max out the database, and then a web server. Then once you've done all that and optimize each one of these lower levels, then start doing these high volume tests. And these kind of duration / marathon tests will really help you identify memory leaks. If the business wants to change a session timeout from an hour to 2 hours, you're going to be able to understand what kind of impact that has on your memory footprint. When I was testing large-scale applications built out for hundreds of thousands of concurrent users, we would always do at least 2 tests for 3 days. So having one test is nice, but you want to have to be able to reproduce the results. So we'd run 2 3-day tests, full scale, in production, very costly, but very valuable to make sure that your systems are gonna be able to hold up. And what you're really going for there is a higher level of confidence in your test results. If I run a test for 30 minutes, I'm not going to know if there's a memory leak. I'm not going to know what happens to my back-end order system after I've placed 5 million orders in it. So you're really looking for test confidence, which then you can share with executives to know that you're going to deliver for the business.
Okay, next question. Is it too late in the year to start testing now?
You should be a little worried. I guess would be my answer to that. There's a lot of things you can get from testing, and I've seen organizations spend 3 weeks getting prepared to run their first test. So from a strategy perspective, being a performance engineer, I like to run a test as soon as possible, and it might be a simple test. It might be creating users and then using those users to log in and log out. If you have login, I mean, you can potentially find issues with that simple process very, very rapidly with low script development, low use case development, and be able to run that quickly in the cycle. And if every use case you test has login, you can really start to cut out some of these features and functionalities on these use cases so that you can take the highest level things, maybe login, view profile, so those might be 2 high usage activities, or login, view dashboard. And I'll tell you what, if you're looking at tuning system type performance defects, so with threading, with memory, with CPU, with thread pooling and database connection pooling, you're going to find a lot of those platform level issues just by running some of those simple tests. You might not find the code issues specific to a function in the application, but at least you can test some platform things if you don't have that much time. So that's definitely my recommendation for getting started. Add complexity as you go, test as early as possible, start with simple use cases.
Okay, another question. Do you keep a formal profile of your application to use as a baseline for comparison?
If you have that, yeah, absolutely. That's something that's very great to have. One problem with, I mean, that's going to be one comparative metric because inevitably that's going to have a ton of use cases, high volume, there's a lot of complexity going on, and what I like to do is have a baseline for each specific thing happening in the application. So call centers, people looking up tickets and closing cases, I want to have a baseline for that, because if you take this one step, you know, the next logical step is you have a baseline, you compare this giant load profile against the baseline, and you see a delta. Where do you go from there? So that's what I'm trying to solve with this, is if you have the kind of bracketed test results for each of the individual use cases under decent load, you can then find which use case it is that's causing it. Of course, if you have some kind of tool that sits in runtime, App Dynamics, Dynatrace, CA Wiley, some of these other things, it's going to help you out a ton there. But for people that don't have those tools, I would recommend breaking down and having multiple baselines. Good question.
Another question. Does high availability environments still need to be tested?
If you're an architect, you might say that it absolutely is. If you're a performance engineer, you might say it absolutely is. So I don't know of anybody that's not testing high availability. You know, being a performance engineer, our job is to test things, not to guess on if things are going to happen. So I will never answer a question of, are we going to be able to do this or that, without running the test. I mean, I'll share the results. I'll give an empirical measurement, and that's the great way to answer the question versus saying, well, it's designed to. You know, somebody does as an executive level doesn't want to hear it's designed to do it. They want to know that we've tested it and these are the exact metrics around it.
Okay. Do you leverage performance models to supplement your load testing?
Yes. And the best way to get a performance model is find out what happened last year, get web logs if possible. Otherwise, you know, you can have, if you have a year one application, you might have the business telling you that we expect to do this many transactions or this many orders or whatever the units may be over the season, that's their KPI. You can then kind of start to extrapolate, you know, Monday is going to be our peak day. That's when everybody's on the system. 2 to 3 o'clock is, you know, people are doing this at work or people use it after hours. Starting with that 15% of peak as your load target is a great place to start if you do not have any of these metrics. If it is a first-year application, probably on the high side of things, but it's a good starting point. Otherwise, yeah. When I'm asked to come in and test an application, I will say, give me a copy of your logs. I want to know what people are doing. What are the main changes to your system and user stories from last year to this year? And then we'll throw those in, and it provides a great starting point.
And the last question for now is, how does continuous deployment work with blackout periods?
Yeah, that's interesting, and I personally don't know. I have come from a lot of situations where blackout period is a blackout period. You have to have VP or above level to make any kind of changes in the organization. So I'd be really curious to hear from people that have continuous integration, continuous delivery, that are still letting, you know, that are still running through this process while blackout occurs. Blackout is a strategy that's implemented in a lot of large shops that completely want to minimize risk so that the order flow, the cash is king, can still find its way through the system without, you know, and not potentially having a new glitch be added. Additionally, if you're doing performance testing, you have to put a stake in the sand somewhere and say, okay, I'm going to do season readiness on this build, this profile. If we make a bunch of changes, we need to at least test that web service, that element, or potentially the entire application if it's like changing from JBoss 7 to JBoss 8. So blackouts are great if you're a performance engineer. I like to, when I was at H&R Block, I like to take my vacations during peak tax time because I knew I did my job with these processes that I shared with you guys, and I was confident that the system was going to be able to handle the load. So if you're out there doing continuous delivery in your peak windows there, that's interesting. Joe, do you have anything to add on that and what you've been seeing with that trend?
I think in retail, blackouts are reality. The only environments I've ever been in that had continuous deployment and no blackouts were financial services and healthcare. Correspondingly, the peak time for financial services typically at the end of the month, end of the quarter, end of the year. And during those times, what you would do in continuous deployment is just schedule around the last 4 or 5 days of the month so that you didn't conflict with an end of cycle period. So the notion of continuous deployment in the context of the business and how it operates is key. There are no continuous deployment operations that don't have some sort of provision to not take tremendous risk to the business and still maintain a deployment cycle.
I think it's a really good point, Joe.
Okay, so that was the last question. I would like to thank our presenters and all attendees, and I want to remind that the performance and capacity conference coming. You can see information on your screen. It would be in November in San Antonio, Texas, in a beautiful hotel right in downtown. And program for this year is exceptional. So I believe that it would be the best CMG conference ever, with a lot of choices. Now we have 6 tracks filled with very interesting presentation for each level. There is some tutorials for beginnings and a lot of advanced session for all levels of performance and capacity professionals. So hope to see you there in San Antonio.